What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Geek Culture Explained. My name is Rob, and in this video, I'm going to be telling you guys how it is that I know why it is the Eternals walked away from involving themselves in the affairs of humanity. One of the things that I love about this YouTube channel is reading your all's comments. You guys may not believe that I read your comments because I guess maybe a lot of YouTubers don't, but I do. And one of the things you guys always tell me is, hey Rob, I thought of this, I thought of that. And while this isn't necessarily based on any particular theory that I saw in the comments, it is based on some comments you guys left, which is that idea of the Celestials seems overly complicated. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what I'm talking about, the idea that we had in the previous videos is that the Eternals basically walked away from involving themselves with humanity because they were told not to by the Celestials. And while that may very well be a possibility because that's what happened in the comics, you guys did make a good point when you said that seems a little overcomplicated for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that got me thinking, what's the number one rule of the MCU? Well, the number one rule of the MCU is basically the same rule as Occam's razor. All things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one. And so having said that, what's the simplest explanation for why it is the Eternals would have walked away from involving themselves in the affairs of mortal men and instead would have simply just sat back and watched everything unfold? The simplest answer is because they chose to. So let's say the Eternals were basically the reason why humanity achieved technology in the first place, which given what we saw in the trailer, they basically are. We saw humanity in a very primitive form. They probably had not invented the wheel. If they had probably just now done it. And so the question is, if humanity is exceedingly basic at that point in time, the Eternals show up with this advanced technology and basically gift humanity technology, and humanity uses that technology to progress to its current form, then we could probably look at the Eternals and say that they loved humanity in the same capacity that a parent loves a child. This is evidenced by all the myriad of scenes that we see over the course of the trailer. One of the Eternals getting their hair brushed by one of the kids, the looks on their faces in terms of happiness and pride and watching humanity grow and progress given the gift of technology given to them by the Eternals. So why would they leave? Let's go to Marvel Comics for a second. So in Marvel Comics, there's a group called the Watchers, and you guys have likely heard of them. The entire policy of the Watchers is non-intervention. They basically just watch the universe unfold and chronicle everything that happens, but it always wasn't that way. Originally, the Watchers were one of the oldest races in the universe. The only race that we know of that might be older than the Watchers would be the races that the Elders of the Universe come from. The Grand Master, who you guys saw in Thor Ragnarok, the Collector by Benicio del Toro, who's been in a whole host of Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. We don't really know much about their races. We just know they're the last surviving members of their races, and that's really all we get. But back to the Watchers. The important thing is that in the early days, the Watchers decided that because they were so technologically advanced, they wanted to share their technology with the universe. So they went to a planet, they provided the technology to that primitive race on that planet, and the result of this is that that race had a kind of golden age where they used that technology to advance themselves. The Watchers looked upon them with pride until that race started splitting up among religious and political lines. This ultimately led to a civil war, and in the end, the technology that was provided to that race by the Watchers was used by that race to essentially destroy themselves. The Watchers were ultimately just crushed and disheartened, and the result of this is they walked away. They stood hands off of the universe and just chronicled everything as it unfolded. Now let's take that concept and let's apply it to the Eternals. Looking at the comments that you guys were giving me, one of the things you guys pointed out with that giant huge landmass is that that's most likely Mesopotamia, and the giant city that we see constructed at the end of the trailer is most likely Babylon. A lot of you guys pointed to the idea of it being the Ishtar Gates as the reason why. Now here in the real world, Babylon was ultimately conquered by Cyrus and the Persians, but let's assume that didn't happen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let's assume that instead, the technology gifted to humanity by the Eternals ultimately led humanity to splitting among these political and religious lines, and that group self-destructed. In turn, the Eternals would look at that and say, no more, and they were ultimately hands off, which really seems to indicate why it is that the Eternals are exceedingly happy and proud when you see them looking at the early days of humanity when they're building great big huge cities and using the technology the Eternals gave them, and then you see the Eternals later on and they look a little sad with regards to where humanity is at the moment. Now I know what you guys are gonna say. Rob, the Watchers already exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We saw them. They were hanging out with Stan Lee. That's true. But just because the Watchers exist does not mean their origin is the same. Case in point, Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. In the comics, she became Captain Marvel because she basically stumbled across what was more or less a wishing machine and then wished to have the same powers as Captain Marvel. And her wish was granted. She went forward as Miss Marvel and then eventually became Captain Marvel during Kelly Sue DeConnick's run. So with all that being said, the question we now have to answer is why are the Eternals just now coming back? If they watched and guided humanity and then basically went hands off because the people in Babylon went nuts and destroyed themselves, why now? I think the answer to this question lies in Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Let's take a look at the motives of the Eternals for a second. If they saw what humanity did in the city of Babylon and they said we can't give them technology anymore because they'll use it to destroy themselves, and they likely dispersed and went about the world and did their own thing. Now you could make an argument that over the course course of human history, we've achieved great things, I think you could also point out that while humanity has done some great things over the course of our history, we've done more things that are actually worse. Would it really be that hard to believe the Eternals just kind of watched humanity as it unfolded and just saw us becoming increasingly more violent, all the different wars and things like that exist? It's no wonder they chose not to intervene anymore. Because if humanity has proven anything to the Eternals over the course of our history following our first encounter with them, it's that they were correct in assuming that humanity was just inherently self-destructive. But all this came to a head with the events of Avengers Endgame. See, the funny thing about Avengers Endgame is that if you look at it for what it is, humanity, for a brief moment in time, had the most powerful artifact in the entirety of the universe. With the Infinity Gauntlet at their disposal, the Avengers could have basically done anything they wanted to. They could have rewritten the entire history of the universe. They could have made themselves God. Captain America and the Avengers could have handed it over to the federal government, and the government could have weaponized it, just like they wanted to do with the Iron Man suit in Iron Man 2. Or the government could have just taken it. Any number of things could have happened. Instead, the Avengers brought back everybody who was dusted, and then Captain America took the Infinity Stones and took them back to their own individual locations. Now, assuming the Eternals didn't really understand the planning that was going on, and assuming they didn't overhear the conversation between the Ancient One and the Incredible Hulk, then they had no knowledge of the fact that this was done because it would disrupt the timeline. Maybe they would have figured it out on its own, who knows? But the important thing here is that if the events of Avengers Endgame did any one particular thing for the Eternals, it's proof that even though humanity had in its possession an incredible weapon that it could have used to obliterate all existence or certainly wipe out anybody they considered to be opposition, instead, they did the right thing. And so that basically verified the fact that humanity is actually capable of incredible things. I think the other reason why the Eternals are coming back is because when you had different conflicts on Earth, it was one thing when it was humanity fighting humanity. It's different when you have an Eternal that's gone awry that shows up on Earth and then decides to just pop off and go nuts. The other possibility here actually lies in the current Eternals comics coming out from Marvel Comics. And one of the things they define Thanos as is being what's called the Sin of Titan, basically the Eternal who went awry. The reason why this matters is because he is inherently of Eternal genealogy. And the fact that humanity had developed superheroes, and the fact that these superheroes were powerful enough to not only topple an Eternal, but then to also do the right thing with all the power they possessed, basically show the Eternals that humanity was more or less ready for them to arrive. Beyond that, I have no clue why the Eternals have returned. I'm curious what your all's comments are. Let me know down below, and I will catch you all later. Peace.